In many of the world's most popular card games, there are really good cards or effects that trade your life total for advantage. I think of Hearthstone, where one of the best hero powers lets you trade 2 life for a free draw, something that basically means as long as you have the life cost to actually pay for that, you can get infinite draws, which helps that particular class have a more consistent way to many cards that other classes wouldn't. In Yu-Gi-Oh!, plenty of great cards have life point costs. In some cases they're smaller, in some cases they're huge, and in today's video I want to talk about all the different levels, or most of the different levels of life point costs, and kind of talk about how you can evaluate cards with these sort of drawbacks and say, are these good or bad? I mention this because in a lot of videos I mentioned that quote-unquote life points don't matter, and while that isn't as true as it used to be because of the new time rules, I think in general most competitive players realize that if a card has a great effect but costs life points compared to a card that has the same effect but doesn't cost life points, but maybe costs like a discard or some other disadvantage, in most cases people are going to choose the life point cost because that's not actual card advantage, and life points don't really matter in the long run as long as you don't lose all of them. For example, a classic comparison that I've made in a few videos that I'll sort of talk about just for a second here is Solemn Strike versus Divine Wrath. Now both of these cards have seen competitive play, but pretty much as soon as Solemn Strike came out, everyone stopped playing Divine Wrath. Now I've mentioned that in past videos, and I still get comments from people that say, well, maybe Divine Wrath is good in a deck that has cards that activate in the graveyard, something like Zombies or Burning Abyss, but when we look at the historically successful strategies using one of these two cards, even if they're playing Zombies or Burning Abyss, in general they're still going to choose Solemn Strike, because even the decks that have effects that activate in the graveyard would rather use life point cost just because it doesn't cost a card in their hand, then they can use their cards for other effects, possibly extra deck summons. Anyway, the two best scenarios for life point costs are as follows. The first scenario is one that is a variable. What I mean by that is something like Soul Charge, where if you don't have a lot of life points, you can use that just as sort of a Monster Reborn or double Monster Reborn, but if it's the first turn and you have a lot of life points, like if you're at 8,000 or 7,000, you can use it for 5,000 life points and bring back a bunch of monsters and make a huge field. Now the reason that Soul Charge is so strong is that it's good in the early and late game because it has a variable life point cost. Historically speaking though, there aren't a ton of cards out there like Soul Charge, so the second sort of best case scenario for life point costs is one that costs half your life. Now that might sound strange to people, especially when you compare it to things that only cost 1,000 or 2,000, but actually in many cases paying half your life points is better than paying a set amount, for the simple fact is that you can activate them no matter how many life points you have. Obviously if you have 8,000 it's going to cost you 4,000 life points, but if you only have 500 it'll only cost you 250 life points. Some great examples of cards that pay half your life points to activate their powerful effects are things like Destrudo or Solemn Judgment or Hero Lives. All three of those cards saw tons of competitive play in a variety of formats, and despite the fact that in some cases you're paying 4,000 life points, what makes these cards so powerful is that you can activate them no matter how many life points you have, versus some of the cards, or I guess all of the cards that we're going to talk about in the rest of today's video, because even in the case of something like Soul Charge, if you only have 800 life points or 900 life points, you can't even bring back one monster, whereas with the cards that pay half your life points can always activate, which gives them a unique advantage against the other cards in today's video. And please realize that I'm not saying that anytime a life point card lets you always activate it automatically makes it competitive. For example, you can pretty much always use the Winged Dragon of Ra because you only have to pay until you have 100 life points left, so it doesn't really matter if you have 8,000 or 4,000 or 1,000. However, like I said, just because a card has a life point cost that you can always activate doesn't make it good. In the case of Ra, it's bad for 1,000 other reasons. It takes 3 monsters to normal summon, it has no protection effects, overall just a very inconsistent card like the other gods or like the Sacred Beast or the Wicked Gods. Just because a card pays life points doesn't automatically make it good. I'm only focusing on the competitively viable life point cost cards in this video. While not quite the best case scenario, a pretty good situation to have on a card is something that pays between 100 and 2,000 life points for a very powerful effect. In the past, we think of cards like Premature Burial and Cosmic Cyclone, and right now I think of cards like Solemn Strike and Solemn Warning. All of these cards are paying a pretty low amount of life points relative to their power level, and that's really what we're looking for out of cards that pay life points. If you have a card that pays very few life points but isn't good, well, it's not going to be played. However, in the case of something like Solemn Strike that only costs 1500 life points, those life points usually won't matter in most situations. Outside of you being at a very, very low life point total, you can pretty much always activate Solemn Strike. And even Solemn Warning, which does have 500 more costs, it still is a very competitive card, especially when it's at 3 copies per deck. And for a long time before Solemn Strike came out, you had a situation where many players were using 2 Solemn Warning and 1 Solemn Judgment in pretty much every single deck. Yes, that seems like a lot of life points, but you have to keep in mind when you're playing all of these cards that cost life points in one strategy, you're not guaranteed to draw all those cards in one game. I think a lot of people, especially casual players, sometimes get confused when they look at deck lists that have all these different life point cost effects, but realize you're not going to draw all those cards, and very likely you only draw a handful of them, so you kind of have to analyze those cards all in the same deck as you would something like 3 Brilliant Fusion and 1 Gem Knight Garnet. Obviously, Brilliant Fusion is not unlimited anymore, but back when those cards were legal at 3 copies, you would see 3 copies of Brilliant Fusion, the card that you wanted to draw, and only 1 copy of Gem Knight Garnet, despite the fact that once you resolve that first Brilliant Fusion, the other 2 copies in your deck are dead. Think of life point cards when you have a lot of them in the same deck, sort of along the same lines, where yeah, if you draw all of them in your opening hand or over the course of a couple turns, you probably can't use all of them. However, in most cases, that won't actually happen, so you want to play as many copies as possible in the decks that can support them, just so you draw them in your opening hand more often. And then you can push the cost up even more and see what kind of cards those have that are competitive. What I'm talking about is, what if a card has 3000 life points as the requirement for activating it? Well, in the past, we've seen things like Solemn Scolding be semi-successful, not the most successful card out there, but definitely a pretty good Solemn card that saw play in Nekros format and Pepe format for a little bit. We also have Gale Dogra, which really hasn't seen that much competitive play. It seems like every time a new Ritual deck comes out, people hype this card up, but realistically, when a lot of the Ritual decks were successful, this card just wasn't being played. You also have something like the Ascended Thunder, which didn't really see a ton of play, but did see some YCS success in a few early Thunder Dragon lists. These are all cards that cost 3000 life points to activate, and they're pretty decent, but you can see there that these effects aren't that much more powerful than the 2000 life point effects, which is probably why you don't see them in that many competitive decks outside of the ones that do things that other cards can't do. Like in the case of Gale Dogra, there's no other card that does that effect. It's just, is that effect really worth the cost? In some cases, yes, but in a lot of cases, probably not. And then you get to the 4000 life point cost, of which there's not really any cards. The only one that I could really think of that always does 4000 is Message in a Bottle, which has a drawback if you don't exceed someone during the turn you activate it. But even that card, you're usually not taking 4000 damage because you're trying to exceed someone with the cards you're summoning. Pretty common. This card isn't going to cost any life points, and outside of that, I don't think there's any cards that always pay 4000 outside of the things that pay half when you're at 8000. Those are obviously different for the reasons that I talked about earlier in this video, but 4000 is really where effects get a little bit more complicated, because here's the thing, as someone that reads a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh comments, anytime I mention that life points don't matter, I always get comments from people saying things like, well, what if a card said draw 3 cards, pay 7000 life points? This is a comment left by someone that probably doesn't really play competitively and is just trying to find a counter to the point that I made, which is perfectly understandable. We can play what ifs all day if we want to, but here's the deal. The likelihood of Konami ever printing a card that says pay 6000 life points, draw 2 cards, or pay 7000 life points, draw 2 cards is pretty low. I don't think that'll happen because it's something that just sort of polarizes the metagame. What do I mean by that? Well, in a vacuum, paying 6000 life points to draw 2 is a pretty fair trade. Certainly, I think a lot of people in a vacuum would play that card if it cost 6000 life points and gave you 2 draws with no other drawbacks. The issue isn't when you're looking at those types of cards, those cards that don't actually exist in theory or on paper, because yes, I would probably pay 6000 life points to draw a card if no one else was doing the same thing, because that's basically not a relevant cost for the decks that were able to draw 2. However, the problem is that if that type of card existed, especially if it was something like pay 7500 life points, yes, those 7500 life points are probably worth the draw 2 effect, but if something like that existed, every single person out there would play Okazi or Magic Cylinder, therefore that card loses a lot of value if people are playing small burn effects to capitalize on other people using that draw spell. This is sort of where a lot of people don't understand where I'm coming from when I say it's not worth debating if a card like that existed, if it would see play, because the answer is that while that card in someone's deck, if you weren't taking into account account other burn effects would probably be very good and would probably help them win a lot of games, because at that point it's say Pot of Desires or Pot of Extravagance with 0 drawbacks besides life points. The problem is that if something like that existed, everyone would just play those burn effects, so it wouldn't be nearly as good as it has the potential to be. In other words, the moral of the story that I wanted you guys to realize in today's video is that generally speaking, when you can pay life points, it's always favored to actually using real cards. In the case of Solemn Strike versus Divine Wrath, even if Divine Wrath is triggering effects, it's much better in most cases to pay life points, because realistically over the course of an entire tournament there are going to be more situations where you don't have a card to discard than situations where you don't have life points to pay. It just turns out that even when you're triggering effects, you still just want to pay the life points because it's more consistent overall. Anyway though, hope you guys enjoyed today's discussion video on life points. This is something that's been highly requested because I often say life points don't matter in my videos. I think I have a couple other ideas to also continue to talk about life points, but this is just where I wanted to start off, and let me know how you guys feel about it, and if you have any other questions, comments, or concerns, make sure to put them in the comment section below. Anyway though, I'll see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Goodbye.